Okay, while the masses are assembling, I guess there's over 50 people, so we have some type of quorum. I want to welcome everyone to this month's edition of the Department of Pediatrics Forum on Racism and Justice. This is a monthly program in the Department of Pediatrics, coordinated by Dr. Susan Wolford and myself, where our goal is to address important and difficult topics and to approach them with candor and directness, and to create an opportunity to have discussions on issues and topics that we would not have really anywhere else or have the opportunity to do that. We welcome all faculty and staff and trainees in the Department of Pediatrics and anyone from any other department in the medical school or around the university who's interested. And I'm now going to turn the program over to Dr. Wolford.
Thank you so much, Dr. Freed. So it's my pleasure today to introduce the speaker. Our speaker today is Dr. Jack Iwashina, who is the Alpheus W. Tucker, MD, Collegiate Professor in the Division of Pulmonary and Critical Care Medicine at the University of Michigan. He's also a co-director for the National Clinician Scholars Program and part of the Survey Research Center at the Institute for Social Research and the Center for Clinical Management Research at the Health Services Research and Development Center of Excellence at the VA here in Ann Arbor. Dr. Iwashina's research focuses on the organization of critical care services to provide high quality and value and improved outcomes. Those of you who attended the excellent inaugural FIRE Grand Rounds this morning heard about the racism discussed in the context of the chronic care model for equity. And this afternoon, we'll consider another approach to thinking about racism and equity, as Dr. Iwashina speaks to us about how patient safety helps me think about equality. And so with that, I'd like to hand over to you, Dr. Iwashina.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wolford, Dr. Freed, for having me. So let me introduce quickly our two other participants. Dr. Katie Epler and Dr. Joe Coney are one of your residents and assistant professors who I know from training components. My experience, Susan, has been that talking to Zoom is dreadfully dull for me and is frankly pretty dull for the audience. And so I much more prefer the interactive bedside style. So we're going to sort of replicate that with a small audience. So I'm going to call on Katie and Joe to every now and then help me think through some things. I should warn them and you that they've not been told what the right answers are. There are right answers. They may or may not get them, but instead to help us think about this a little bit and just break up some of the monotony. I guess let me share my screen. And dogs are walking through my room, so you guys will just forgive me for that. And we'll get this done. Okay, I should also add that I am a proud VA employee, and I speak for neither the current nor an incoming administration, and the stuff I'm saying is not the official policy of the US government or the Department of Veteran Affairs. With that, let's get started. So here's what we're going to do. There's going to be three parts of the talk. It's going to get progressively more uncomfortable as it goes on. First, we're going to talk about patient safety. And it's going to feel very familiar because patient safety is one of the great triumphs, the way we've reorganized our healthcare system over the last 20 years. So we're going to talk about the way patient safety emphasizes the central role of systems and resources in creating a safe hospital. It makes it easy for the right thing. It makes the right thing the easy thing and helps it make it easy for doctors and nurses to be safe. The next part is then I'm going to do contemporary sociology in 5 minutes or less, where I'm going to argue that contemporary sociology likewise emphasizes a central role of systems and resources in sustaining white supremacy. I'm going to define white supremacy, and we're going to have to talk about that and look it square in the face, and that may be a little uncomfortable. It'll be okay. And then it's going to get really uncomfortable, where we're going to talk about changing systems. And I'm particularly going to say that changing whose lives our system makes it easy to save demands acknowledging competing values and designing mitigating strategies by talking through 3 cases, 2 of them from my last July block in the ICU. Katie was on this service with me to help really make clear the way if we're going to be serious about valuing Black lives and having our institution not reproduce white supremacy, we have to ask what we're willing to give up for that. But let's start happy. It's lunchtime. Katie, can you unmute yourself? The Swiss cheese model. Have you seen the Swiss cheese model at some point before in your medical training?
Yes, I have.
And Katie, what does the Swiss cheese model, how does that help us think about patient safety?
My poor explanation of this, but essentially there are several things that lead to a poor outcome. So if you look at things systems based, typically you think about several like slices of Swiss cheese, and all of these holes in various layers of the system have to have, you know, the holes lined up in order for something to fall through and a poor outcome to happen.
And have you ever heard stories, and maybe Gary can unmute himself and tell us if he ever remembers these stories, of before we thought about the Swiss cheese model, how we used to think about errors?
I think more laying blame, you know, focusing on someone who did something wrong and, you know, made a mistake.
Exactly, right? You found the highest ranking, non-tenured faculty member or resident involved in the case, and then you just talked about their character flaws and why they were a bad person. If they were a woman, oh, did you yell at them about how they just weren't committed enough. And honestly, I remember that, right? So it was a pretty pervasive culture. I'm sure this never happened in pediatrics, but I'm an internist, right? And so in internal medicine, we yelled at people. When I was a sub-I on cardiology, we were expected to present our note. We took in-house call every 3 nights, and we were expected to present our patients the next day from memory without notes. And I got the dose of ramipril that one of our patients was on wrong, because I was a 3rd-year medical student who hadn't slept all night and was being asked to remember the creatinine 3 specific digits and also the ramipril dose. And shockingly, I got it wrong. And we stopped rounds for a good 5 or 10 minutes where our senior attending professor explained to me in depth how medicine is a sacred profession, sacred trust, Katie. It's a sacred trust. And you have to treat every patient like they're your grandmother. And if you don't care enough about your own grandmother to remember her ramipril dose, maybe you should reconsider your choices. Which, you know, like it's an approach, and like there are definitely bad apples out there, but like it's not really the way we think about these things. All right, Katie, you're off the hook for a little while. Right, increase it in the battle days, exactly like Katie said, when we sought the explanation for an error, we blamed an individual. Whereas in the modern conception of patient safety, we understand errors as often generated by system design. We frankly don't think that we're going out and hiring psychopaths left and right. We think most of our bosses do a decent job of hiring decent people. And so when bad things happen, we ask, how did the system produce it? We don't think that it's because of a character flaw where we seek the person who just doesn't care about that patient as much as their grandmother and just isn't devoted. Instead, we ask, how does it emerge from context, right? What are the multiple layers of failures that needed to happen? Exactly like Katie was talking, for that error to make it all the way to the patient. Likewise, we've changed how we fix errors. We don't spend nearly as much time scolding and shaming involved clinicians. Instead, we say it's a system problem. And so how do we change the procedures and the equipment? I think of the canonical example of this as the approach to intubations or the approach to putting in a line, right? Where in the old day, you kind of wandered all over the hospital to find whatever you wanted, and then you kind of stuck us up together, and because you could never find the drapes, you said, oh, don't worry, I just won't breathe while I'll do it. Whereas now, there's a line kit, and you just make it easy to have all the equipment that you need to actually sterilely insert a line. In the old days, where we were going to really like risk drumming people out of the profession, we actually have a very high standard for what constituted an error, right? Only something that hurt a patient was an error and needed to be scolded and shamed, because you couldn't go scold and shame every time something didn't happen. And so there was the no harm, no foul rule, right? Like if it didn't hurt somebody, that's fine, just don't let it happen again. Whereas increasingly in the patient safety approach, we adopt a population level approach and we try to learn from near misses. And finally, there's been a major pivot from whose perspective we center. In the old days, we asked, were the clinicians trying to hurt patients? If they weren't negligent, then it's okay. Bad things happen. Whereas in the modern patient safety era, we say what matters is, are patients getting hurt? Are there avoidable harms that are happening to patients and in pediatrics and to their families? And how can we fix that, regardless of whether it was anybody's intent, or often just recognizing that that'll happen despite good intent. And so we have this kind of systematic reframing in patient safety that's been really quite remarkable, and a displacement of power from attendings down to house staff and nurses, who now have not merely the power, but the obligation to say, hey doc, maybe you could wash your hands before you go do that sterile procedure. A move to systemic explanations, not explanations rooted in individual character flaws or bad apples. The focus is on changing what we do more than how we think. The focus is on understanding the population impact on outcomes, and that recognizes that everybody has a role in patient safety. And many of us have seen some version of that motto tattooed on foreheads, right? Everybody has a role in patient safety. The people who need to change are us, not just those other people over there who are doing crazy, outlandish stuff, but us in order to incorporate this. And this is often an interesting challenge when you step into that senior resident fellowship or early attending role, to figure out how to think about us and create a culture that really identifies opportunities for us to do better. Because, Joe, have you ever seen this quote before? This is my sense that you're relatively young, so you may not have, but the QI people have this thing tattooed on the inside of their eyeballs, right? Right, so every system is perfectly designed to get the results it gets. And what does that mean, Joe?
So I think, if you're looking to have good outcomes, then this system is perfectly designed for it. If you're getting poor outcomes, then you've also perfectly designed the system to get those poor outcomes.
Right, you can't have an outlier event every damn week, right? At some point, you have to admit that the outliers aren't outliers. They're actually a predictable product of the system. And conversely, that a well-designed safe system should not require extra effort by clinicians to be safe, right? And a system should make the easy thing the right thing. All right, so Katie, any of this scary yet?
What did you say?
Is any of this scary yet?
A little bit.
All right, well, it's going to get scarier. All right. So we're going to throw up 8 polls. For those of you who are residents, this is going to drive you crazy because this is going to look like multiple choice questions, and you're going to have little flashback seizures to ever getting something wrong. For those of you who aren't, they're just, tell me your best guess. It's just to frame our conversation in a few data. We got to move through them pretty quickly, so you're going to get about 20 seconds to answer. All right. So poll number 1, what fraction of the poll number 1, what fraction of the US population is white? Don't Google it. Don't overthink it. Just tell me. All right. Sorry, my mouse disappears. All right, Joe, you're doing odds for us, right? So median of about 60%, spread between 40 and 80%. All right, next up, poll number 2. What fraction of the US population is Black? These seem like reasonable, fair questions, right? For us to, we're a year into a national conversation about race. All right, I'm gonna cut some of you guys off. Median guess of about 20%, ranging from 10 to 50%. Getting a little harder now. What is the median household income for white households in the United States? spread between 30,000 and 105,000, which suggests that I may have not set your options wide enough, with a modal median guess of between 60 and 75. All right, you guys can probably guess what the next question is. What's the median household income for Black households in the US? All right, a lot less spread here, 30 or 45, a few people saying 60. All right, we're halfway done here, folks. You're doing great. What is the median net worth for white households in the US? Order of magnitude: -16, 0, plus 16,000, plus 160,000, plus 1.6 million. All right, pretty tightly clustered between 16 and 160. I will say, I gave this talk in National Jewish, which is apparently better paid than I am, because there are 3 people there who thought it was positive 1.6 million. It is not. Oops, sorry. Poll 6. Same question, Black households in the United States. Sorry about you're seeing my slides in the background. Super evenly split between -16, 0, and positive 16, with 2 people saying plus 160. 2 more questions. What fraction of students in the Detroit metropolitan area, you guys are pediatricians, you know about schools, would need to move to a different school in order for the schools to mirror the racial composition of Detroit Metro? How segregated are Detroit metropolitan area schools? Oh, sorry, share results. So pretty damn segregated as far as you guys are concerned. Between 70 and 80% of students would need to move, which is just a baffling number if you just think about that. But with some folks saying no, only 40%. And last one. In absolute numbers, given whatever you think the distribution of the population is, in absolute numbers, are there more white or Black sentenced federal and state prisoners? All right, this is the strongest split I've seen in any of the places I've done this poll. 82-18 for more Black. All right, answers coming up shortly. All right, let me go backwards a little bit. So look, over the next 5 minutes, I'm going to talk to you about how sociologists think about this, because sociologists have been thinking about race and racism in a way that is more sophisticated than the standard medical discourse has been. The first thing they're going to do is just take it as a truism that the vast majority of very real effects of race in a patient's life are mediated by differences in social interactions and resources, not genes or biology. I am simply going to stipulate that the genes and biology stuff's not very important, and there's almost no evidence outside of a handful of specific conditions that it is particularly important. And even for the classic example, I would ask you, do you really think the difference between our CF center and our sickle cell center is best explained by the differences in those 2 genes? Maybe you do. Happy to take that conversation in the Q&A. But remember, the fact that it's not in our genes doesn't mean it's not consequential, right? So I think we can all agree that being a doctor, nah, it's totally socially constructed, right? Like absolutely nothing about my genetics that makes me a doctor. Having hospital privileges, definitely socially constructed. But if I walk into an ICU with a license where I'm privileged, I can save some lives. And if I walk in, and if somebody who walks in who's not an MD and doesn't have hospital privileges, they're not going to be able to save lives. More people would be dead, just as a difference of the same social constructions. Sorry. So when sociologists think about the way racism has been socially constructed and enacted in the United States, they draw a distinction. They say there used to be something called Jim Crow racism. And this is the kind of racism that I think we're most familiar talking about. This is the use of the law, de jure, plus interpersonal enforcement of racism based on explicit exclusion from opportunities of people socially classified as Black. And we all are comfortable with that. And just about everybody in America, not everybody, but just about everybody in America is pretty comfortable at least acknowledging that that is wrong. In contrast, they're going to say, look, there's not nearly as much the Jim Crow racism, but that doesn't mean that outcomes have necessarily changed as much, because there remains what's called in sociology colorblind racism, the exclusion from opportunity and resources of people socially classified as Black by actions that do not explicitly reference race, but will nonetheless disproportionately have disproportionate impacts and benefits by race. And they argue that there are 4 ways that this can go on. And in the interest of time, I'm just going to skim by these. But there's abstract liberalism, right? Like the belief that whatever's done to one person must be done to every other person, even though those systems are clearly not going to be enacted with the same results. There's the argument that racism is only about biology. And I don't have any problems with people's biology. They're just some kind of cultures that just don't really fit into the way the Western world works. There's a naturalization, an argument the reason that Ann Arbor Hills is disproportionately, overwhelmingly white is not because historical redlining, segregation, or exclusion of African Americans. It's just that white people naturally want to be like others of their kind. Or the minimization of current relevance. They're saying, oh yeah, no, we agree. Jim Crow segregation, horrible. But thank God Bobby Kennedy solved all that for us in 1967. And it's just, all the systems now work totally fairly. Because this leads to what sociologists call systemic racism, which is the creation and perpetuation of racialized differences in access to opportunities and resources. That's incredibly importantly, that function without the need for individual racial hate or prejudice. And so that you can see, they argue, the evidence of systemic racism when you see things like this. You look at the group of African-American in the green and white in the pink, folks who were born to equivalent families, grew up in the middle class, and you ask where they're sorted in the US. And by the time they're in their 40s, it's great New York Times animation. You can spend hours exploring data about the United States in this. Those same middle class adults, whites end up richer and Blacks end up poorer. So let's go back to some of our questions with that little context and just get in some facts. So Joe, what did the Pediatric Forum think the average percent white in this country was?
The most was 60, ranged 40 to 80.
Yeah, so you're right. The standard numbers at the bottom, white alone, not Hispanic or Latino, 60%. Boom, nailed it. What about what fraction of the country is Black, Katie?
Median was 20%, ranging from 10 to 58%.
Yeah, so this is a ubiquitous finding that folks think the country is much more African-American than it is. It's 13.4%. It just is. You know, with another 18% of the country self-identifying as Hispanic or Latinx at this point. Awesome. All right, median household incomes. What was the guess for white households?
It was 60 to 75,000. The range was 30 to 105.
Boom, pediatrics nailed it. 71,000, right? Maybe even a little better off than the department thinks. People are, I'm told that peds sometimes is not the most well remunerated of the departments in the medical school. So maybe, what about for Black households?
Mostly 30 to 45,000, some up to 60,000.
Yeah, so the actual number is 41,000, right? So, so on the other hand, 41,000 is actually a decent wage, right? It's, you can do okay with that. It's probably not what our HO1s get paid, right? Our HO1s get paid a little more than that, right? and as our folks go on. But you know, 70 to 40, it's only $30,000 different. But on the other hand, it's 30,000 difference. So Katie, in your experience as a house officer, sitting at the house officer price point, if you had an extra $30,000 this year, would you live differently?
Yeah.
Yeah, you probably would. All right, let's talk about household net worth, right? This is kind of mobilizable resources in the event of a crisis. Joe, what was our guess for white households?
It was 16 to 160 with the most saying 160.
Boom, you got the most socially aware department on the campus. It's exactly 163. Katie, what about for Black households?
We had a split between negative 16,000 and positive 16,000.
Yeah, so you guys are actually more pessimistic. It's the best data that I could find is from the 2019 current population survey, suggests it's about 16,000. And I want you to remember those two numbers, right? 163 versus 16. Because those numbers, that's a big difference, right? And they're sort of in an interesting price point for when we talk about our cases. Two last ones. More white and more Black prisoners. I don't even need to go to my interlocutors for this. You guys knew it was more African Americans, despite being 13 versus 60% of the population, are still a clear majority of the folks in prison. And then the last question, how segregated was Detroit? What fraction of students would need to move to a different school?
We said 70 to 80, but some down as low as 40.
There it is, 73%. Now, Katie, are you from Michigan?
No, I'm not.
All right, then Joe, you've been here for a little while, right?
Yep.
So you see how there's that horizontal line where there's like a whole lot of green below it and a whole lot of blue above it? What is that? That must be some really important natural feature, right?
Is that 8 Mile Road?
That is 8 Mile Road. So do you know what these dots are? Why don't we make sure, what am I showing you guys in this map?
This looks like the, kind of redlining of, it looks like white above 8 Mile and black below 8 Mile. It's pretty starkly divided right there.
Yeah, I mean, like it's just like it is kind of hard to believe that this isn't painted on, right? Like this does not look like a natural mixing process. You ever seen the wall on 8 Mile Road, Joe?
No.
You know, they have a wall, right? There's a big chunk of folks where literally there's a wall put up because there's a little bit of train track and it helps protect people from the train track by just coincidentally making it really hard to cross 8 Mile Road. All right, Katie, this is the advanced map question. What's that thing kind of in the bottom left corner? Do you recognize that little like appendage sticking out?
I do not. I'm really bad with maps.
All right, Joe, where are we down here?
Can you see that home?
Yeah, it's Ann Arbor. Right, so what's this curve? You recognize that curve?
Is that the highway, I guess, around there?
Yeah, right, that's the curve of 23 onto 14, right? And what's this green spot over here?
Ipsy.
Yeah, and what's this blue?
I don't know that neighborhood.
That's basically, this is Arbor Hills,
okay.
Right? That's just above the river. It's actually, it's an extraordinary map. You can spend hours if you're a map nerd looking at this. You can actually trace the Huron River, which also has a very nice, not very nice, very clear segregation component to it between grad student housing and other Ann Arbor housing, right? Like even Ann Arbor, right? 54% of students would need to move to a different school. And that's despite the fact that we have 3 gigantic integrated high schools. So at the primary school level, I love my neighborhood school. Oh man, is it not integrated. Anybody who's ever been to Scarlett Mitchell knows just how different those schools are than the rest of Ann Arbor. So what this totality of the data I just showed you in the thinking is, Bonilla Silva summarizes in Racism Without Racists, saying basically following the colorblind script, whites support almost all the goals of the civil rights movement in principle, but object in practice to almost every policy that has ever been developed that would make those goals a reality. They abhor Black self-segregation and the conversation about why Black students sit at the table by themselves at the cafeteria. But they don't have any problem with their own racial segregation because they don't see that as a racial phenomenon. That's just natural. And finally, although they sing loudly the colorblind song, stating that calling someone a racist is just the worst thing you can do in America, just the worst thing, they live a white color-coded life. That the sociologic perspective changes how we think about racism. It moves it away from thinking about individual prejudice and the problem of weeding out bad apples or specific racists, and focus instead on systemic disadvantage and racial access to resources. It argues, in fact, that correcting attitudes is a slow and late process that is not necessarily going to be a major driver of equity, but instead you need to correct procedures to ensure that resources are redistributed. You need to move away from a current US legal conception of prejudice as binary, either someone was discriminated against or not, and specific, that you can only call it discrimination if the only reason for the differential outcome was bad, identifiable and cognizable bad intent by the racist in question, to understanding a probabilistic population-based thing that shows evidence of differential outcomes as evidence of persistent systemic racism. And it argues that when we think about, again, who needs to change, we can't just blame those racists over there. It's not just their fault. Instead, we need to ask, what are each of our own roles? Because, Professor Crystal Fleming argues, the racial order in which we live has a name, and that name is white supremacy. The problem is not an abstract differentiating by race. The problem is that white supremacy is the political, social, and economic dominance of people socially defined as white. That white supremacy, she argues, is about power. The bottom line is that white supremacy is about resources, who gets and retains access to them, who gets excluded, and then in two phrases that kind of broke me this summer, whose lives are made to matter and whose lives are rendered disposable. That whose lives are made to matter and whose lives are rendered disposable. Because, our sociological colleagues argue, every system is perfectly designed to get the results that it gets. And that in the modern era, the fascinating thing about these institutions is you don't need racial animus. You don't need some Colonel Sanders character wandering around spouting horrible language in order to reproduce racism. The system's gotten smarter than that. It'll do it all by itself without anybody needing to do anything uncomfortable. So I've read this stuff and I thought about this and I was like, yeah, that's totally a great analysis of those. But I'm glad I'm so woke, right? I got my little Black Lives Matter piece on my badge. Like, surely this doesn't apply to me. And then I was rounding in July, kind of right after I'd reread Crystal Fleming's book about whose lives were made to matter and whose lives were disposable. And three cases occurred to me, and I want to talk us through a little bit of those now. So the first, I don't remember if you remember this lady. I don't know if you remember this lady, Katie, in bed 16. I'm going to ask you to start. 74-year-old woman, maybe bed 16. 74-year-old woman, delight, just a delight, who requests transfer to our ICU from an outside hospital. She's got an obstructed right ureter, concern for low-grade sepsis. She's like sick, but not crumping. There are 6 other transfer requests for the same 2 beds. They're all of broadly similar urgency. And so her son, who's a long-term administrator at our hospital, calls and asks for his mom to be taken first. And so we do. Of course we do. So Katie, what are the conflicting values at stake in this case?
Conflicting values. So, I mean, I think looking at equity and justice, like, we have limited resources. We're trying to weigh the urgency and, who deserves the bed. But in the end, conflicting values of wanting to take care of our own seems to weigh out.
Yeah, right. Loyalty matters, right? Loyalty matters. And honestly, at the end of 2020, if you don't think loyalty matters, you have not been working in this health system, right? There is not a resident and a fellow in this health system. There's not a nurse or an MA who has not bled at the end of this year for the health system. And it does not seem unreasonable to say that if you have actually bled for this health system, that you have taken not merely pay cuts, but worked so many hours, so selflessly, maybe we should do for our own, right? Because loyalty to teammates matters. And moreover, this was a woman who did need ICU care. Like, it turns out they were doing a much worse job of taking care of her than was immediately obvious from the transfer. And like, it turns out they'd like diagnosed cancer in her and just hadn't gotten around to telling her yet. So like, we definitely improved her quality of her care. But at the same time, there's something that doesn't seem entirely scalable about this and doesn't quite feel like fairness. And so on the one hand, there's nothing racial about this case, right? There is absolutely nothing racial about this case. But on the other hand, if you ask who understands the way the healthcare system works well enough to be able to call my colleague and page them at home and ask them to jump their mom to the top of the queue, that's going to be disproportionately our administrators and fellow faculty, right? It's hard to believe our housekeeping teams are going to be quite as comfortable making that phone call, right? And so the system that is in no way racial is absolutely racial, because the folks who have to whom we owe loyalty, who have the empowerment to take advantage of that loyalty, are going to be disproportionately white. And as the U of M provides superb care, and we do, we're going to disproportionately save white lives using this kind of a system. What about another one? This is bed 4, Katie. 39-year-old gentleman, hepatitis C, you remember him, don't you? Transferred to our ICU in hepatic encephalopathy, hepatorenal syndrome, low-grade shock. If you're not an ICU doc, just say he was sick as stink. He had been actively drinking until a few days before admission, and neither our liver transplant team nor anywhere else in Michigan was willing to consider him for evaluation until he was 6 months sober. And I am a damn fine intensivist, if I say so myself, but I could not keep this guy alive for 6 months. His parents requested that I arrange transfer to the University of Maryland, who will consider him for a transplant. I called them. Maryland said, we love him. We just need you to do a few more tests. So we spent about 3 days running tests. I asked my house staff to do the transfer paperwork. They said, Dr. Iwashina, that's not how this works. We bring people into this health system. We do not know how to transfer people out. We can send them to the floor, but we don't know how to transfer them to another ICU. That's not a thing we do. So I had to do a lot of the paperwork myself. We worked with social work, set it up. He could go to Maryland. They would accept him as long as his parents paid for fixed wing transport from DTW to BWI. And so they just needed to come up with $50,000. And if they did, their son could go to Maryland, where he would be given a liver probably within a week or two. If they couldn't, he would die at the University of Michigan. So Joe, what are the conflicting values we've got here?
I mean, fairness is the biggest thing, I think, with transplants. I think clearest, most obvious case of a limited resource and needing to ration care. And so I think you're conflicted from this. Sounds like a patient who would benefit or has potential to benefit from a transplant, and he's a patient that you've probably connected with and probably want to get a liver. But at the same time, if you, if you were a family that didn't have the connections or resources, which is already unfairly distributed to pay for a $50,000 flight, then you're going to end up with, exactly like you said, is there's going to be a disparity in who gets a liver, which is, one of the things that we should be most fair in, is who lives or dies.
And Joe, it's an ICU doc.
Yeah.
Is our propensity to do just some things for our patients, or does the idea of moving somebody across 5 state lines who's sick as stink kind of actually like right in our sweet spot?
Yep, that's perfect. If we can put them on ECMO first, it'd be even better.
Right, like we do batty stuff a different word almost came out, right? And that's what ICUs exist to do, right? I had the option to do the right thing for this specific patient, to do a thing that would potentially be, if Maryland is right, be curative intent and give him 50 years of survival after this. And I don't say this very often, I had informed parents who were Googling stuff and bringing to me factual information that I did not know, that they then reasonably presented to me for my consideration as on an alternative treatment strategy. And we don't think about parents a lot. I know you guys do, Joe. Parents who are willing to work with you as partners who bring you new data that you haven't to, that's not like an everyday occurrence, right?
More often than you think, but yes, agreed.
Right, like you want to support that, right? Like,
yeah.
But so $50,000. That falls right between two numbers of net worth, Katie, right? So Katie, what was the median net worth for white Americans?
160, right?
Yeah, right. Like you can swing that, right? 50 is going to suck, but you can swing that. What was it for Black Americans?
16.
Yeah, a lot of real estate between 16 and 50 if you got to get that plane on the tarmac tomorrow, right? So on the one hand, right, nothing racial about this, but definitely everything racial about this. And moreover, right, it's not just at cost. We held this guy in the unit for 3 days, spent tens of thousands of dollars in additional testing. And I spent 3 to 4 hours a day for 3 days in a row on the phone, trying to figure out how to make this work, right? And those are beds that weren't helping other people, that were only possible because this person had potentially the resources to be able to move. So let's talk. I made these slides in September. It was the next surge then, now it's this surge. Right, 14.1% of Michigan is African-American. 39% of the deaths in the state from COVID so far have been in the African-American community. Michigan medicine lost an amazing amount of money. When we pivoted in the spring to open the RICU, take over your BMT unit, right? And we saved a lot of lives, right? We'll talk about the data in a second, but we lost a lot of money. As of about 3 weeks ago, we had about 10% of the ICU beds in the state of Michigan, had about 2% of the 3% of the patients. Those numbers aren't accurate, but the general ratio is pretty close. We're basically out of capacity now. We're up to 21, 22 beds because we've chosen not to open the respiratory ICU in order to preserve capacity for other kinds of procedures. So I'm going to show you some data. I'm going to ask you not to share this outside the University of Michigan because this is, we've identified data that's in general de-identified. So we have here this is some data that was published in JAMA Internal Medicine. We got on the horizontal axis, about 35 different hospitals just ranked on their inpatient mortality among COVID-positive ventilated patients in the spring surge. On the vertical axis, we see their mortality. They range from about 16%, places like MGH published that, places like 80%. That big black dot there, that's Michigan. We were at 25, 30%, depending on exactly what numbers you use. After risk adjustment, this graphic looks exactly the same. After reliability adjustment, this graph looks exactly the same. We know, frankly, that a lot of other hospitals in Michigan have numbers that look more like on that right curve, because these were hospitals that were still together enough to submit to a registry. And so that means there are hospitals, and we definitely know this is true in the state of Michigan, that had at least a 40% mortality. Still pretty respectable, all things considered. But that means for those hospitals, if we had transferred patients from their care to our care and could do so safely, we would have had a number needed to treat of 10. 1 in every 10 patients who we moved from that hospital to our hospital would have lived who would otherwise have died. But there's another chunk of hospitals, plenty of them in Southeast Michigan, who had at least a 20% worse mortality than we did. That means a number needed to treat of 5. 1 in every 5 patients we accepted and transfer from them. And there's no reason to think that these different numbers are any different in the current surge. 1 in 5 of those patients lives if they get cared of in Michigan and dies someplace else. in part because of folks like Joe and Katie who stepped up so selflessly to serve outside their traditional training areas to provide superb care. Because we're really good at this. There's even a well-described chunk of patients, both in this data set in Michigan, who had more than a 33% mortality worse than the University of Michigan does. It's a number needed to treat of 3. 1 in every 3 patients we make a bed for who has COVID ARDS and we accept the patient and transfer, we save who we leave to die at the other hospital that they are. But we knew this. We've had this data for months. We've been sharing it for months. This is our plan. In order to open the RICU, we need to divert nurses who know how to run drips and are comfortable around ventilated patients. Nursing has not secured staff to support the RICU. And so despite us having as many hospitalized and ICU patients in the state of Michigan as we had in the spring surge, we have not opened a RICU. We're just running it on the back of our standard ICUs. Because we decided not to invest in the nurses who had the skills over the summer to train for this. And we want those the only place you get ICU competent nurses, other than training them, is you take them from the ORs and you take them from the cardiovascular units. Only place that they exist. And so you need to divert from our ORs to our cardiovascular unit. So this is the challenge, right? Michigan medicine doesn't provide negative value care. We provide a lot of care. Those nurses are working their butts off right now to provide care that provides us 5 to 10% absolute mortality reduction for our traditional patients, which, as you know, skew 90% white on the adult side. And we're choosing to focus our care on providing that 5 to 10% mortality. And we are refusing to accept transfers who have COVID ARDS, which will be disproportionately African-American, where we can provide a 20 to 60% absolute mortality reduction. I'm not going to ask you, Katie and Joe, to articulate this one out loud, right? So on the one hand, like, you gotta make money for anyone to do any good, right? Like, if the lights don't stay on, the health system gets broken and then nobody gets saved. So you can't just pursue all charity care. If you're going to expand the RICU, you're going to do it on the back of physician scientists, right? Our full-time clinicians don't have more weeks to give. The only way you do this is you basically shut down the research enterprise among physician scientists who are ICU competent and pull them all to work the extra shifts. And a lot of them are my mentees. A lot of them are me. And most Michigan medicine care is of value, right? We saved, at least by this data, 40 to 60 lives in the spring surge, but at least 4 patients who were scheduled to get cardiovascular surgery that was deferred had heart attacks in the intervening 6 months. And so, yeah, those 40 to 60 were not free. Identifiable patients died because we chose to reprioritize. You can decide whether 40 to 60 lives, and I can't not say it, right, that we're 48% Black are less valuable than 4 lives. That would have been, given our numbers, 3 to 4 white lives, or they're more valuable. The way you assign the nurses is the way you tell your values, because we could save the lives of perhaps 1 in 3 COVID ARDS patients who are cared for here rather than elsewhere, because we're really good at this. But our existing transfer networks do not recruit from the poorer, Blacker parts of the state. That's not a coincidence. That's a design decision. And so that sucks, right? Like, when I started giving this talk, I was hoping to give it as a chance of persuading us that we should open our transfer and we should reprioritize. The surge is here. We didn't. The RICU is still closed. Right? Contemporary systemic racism does not require active, explicit, or implicit bias. I am not saying that anyone in this hospital said, like, how can I figure out a way to be racist in order to do this? To result in differences in the value of Black and white lives. But our standard operating procedures will and continue to reproduce inequality and white supremacy. We save white lives, not Black lives, disproportionately. The patient safety movement demonstrates that incremental, often bottom-up change can shift deep systems of power. right? The patient safety movement is a counterexample to the nihilism that says, well, we just have to fix all of society before we can fix the hospital. That is not true. Patient safety clearly shows that we can make incremental improvements in the hospital by itself. But change will require work, changing how our systems provide resources and whose lives it's easy to save. And the lives it's easy to save are the lives we actually value, regardless of what we say. Because winter's still coming. It's not here yet. The flu hasn't really kicked in, as you guys know so well, and choices need to be made. So I've tried to argue that patient safety emphasizes the central role of systems and resources in creating a safe hospital. And contemporary sociology parallels that thinking to argue the central role of systems and resources, not individual animus, in sustaining white supremacy. The changing systems, changing whose lives our system makes it easy to save, demands acknowledging competing values. It's not free anymore, and designing mitigating strategies. Because every system's perfectly designed to get the results that it gets. And that's the kind of crappy slide that I used to end this on. But I tell you, I've been thinking a lot more about this phrase. The best time, this little trite phrase says, the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. The second best time is now. We can't let the fact that we didn't act prevent us from acting now. We still have a choice this afternoon and tomorrow and the day after. And with that, Susan, if I can bring it back on, I'm happy to take any questions or comments from the audience. Thanks so much, Katie and Joe, for helping me. I know it's not easy, particularly for those last few slides, to be on camera. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Katie, Joe, Jack. Thank you. You're right. The last few slides, actually, it's just all quite painful to hear and to think about. But thank you for sharing those thoughts with us. One of the things that came out this morning in Grand Rounds was that the first step in much of this is awareness. And I think that you have brought a different level of awareness to some of these issues than many of us may have heard before. And so for that, I'm very, very grateful. We have some questions in the Q&A, and please please add your questions to the Q&A, and we will put them to Dr. Iwashina.
And I'm almost assuredly wrong in some of the details, and I may be wrong in some parts of this argument. So if there are better ways to think about this, by all means, please reach out to me. Sorry to interrupt you, Susan.
Oh no, that's totally fine. And I mean, I think that this is one of the reasons for this forum is thinking of considering different ways of thinking of this issue. But what I think is very clear from what you have brought out is that systems need to change. While there are many other things that can change. And as individuals, we should all work on ourselves as well. But systems really need to change. And that can make a huge difference. But let me get to the question rather than, let me see. It says, does a change in the knowledge base of how to best care for COVID inpatients decrease the differential between UMich and the hospitals on the right-hand end of your curve?
So we don't know. So maybe. I would say it's hard. It will probably flatten it. It ain't going to get it flat. Susan, do we have time for me to tell one just heartbreaking story?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So at the VA, right, I worked on as a part of the fourth mission, right? We actually opened the VA to civilians and basically said, just send them to us. And the hospitals that sent them to us were overwhelmingly small hospitals that were just, I had never taken care of an ARDS patient before. And frankly, a lot of whose ICUs are now full. And we had one woman come to us after 10 days at one of the smaller hospitals in Detroit, mid-40s, beautiful black skin, had been hypoxemic as hell. So they'd done what's called proning her, putting her on her belly for the 10 days, which is absolutely an evidence-based therapy. But they'd never proned anybody before, so they didn't know how to pat her. So when she came to us, she had, I could see the bone of her forehead, the bone of her cheek, and the bone of her jaw, because they've been, in some sense, doing evidence-based therapy, but they hadn't known how to pat her head and how to move her. And so she had bed sores that had eroded down to her skull, because you just can't learn the details of how you pad somebody for 7 or 8 days from a webinar. And so, like, I wish great ICU care came down to 3 easy tricks that you could download a Google component of it. But it turns out we've spent the last decade through efforts like Keystone ICU teaching those to people. And the ones that are left are hard and require well-practiced teams. And so, yeah, I mean, if, right, the recovery trial and the spread of dexamethasone will flatten that curve somewhat. It's not going to take it to flat, because we weren't giving dexamethasone. We actually didn't, we said no to steroids before that trial came out. And so that was to us despite not using one of the therapies that was going to be proven to be efficacious.
Thank you for answering that. We have, I think, one comment and a question. I'm going to go with the comment first. It says, painful to think about. This spring, when Detroit hospitals had run out of PPE, it felt selfish but safe to know that was working hard to ensure there would be enough PPE for me. Getting to the issue of scarce resources there. And then another question here, I believe. It says, it seems to me that moving around, the U of M system has a mission that emphasizes quality of care, research, and education, but does not include an element of responsibility to the community. To contrast with other institutions who are more rooted in a mission of service to a local community. Can we shift the mission of our institution? And if so, how do we tackle this? I really find that question so important, because the community, the role in the community, I think, is vital. So just got a couple of minutes for any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's haunted us all for the last years, the last months. I got to say, it has been deeply depressing to watch a large group of senior faculty and leaders who spend most of their life walking from situation they command to situation they command. When I've had this conversation going, oh yeah, no, I can't influence transfer policy. And the sort of acquired learned helplessness is remarkable, right? Yeah, like the med students can't fix this. But if you've got tenure, you could fix this. I mean, we almost fired our president because he gave the wrong masks to the undergrads, right? This has been a challenging component for our faculty, in particular our senior faculty, of which I count myself as one of them, who have chosen to look outward rather than to ask where we could put our bucket down and how we could fix this, right? Our RICU is not open because we as a faculty continue to see the other patients and to continue to schedule elective procedures for the other components. We weren't doing those cases. Those nurses would be free. You know those nurses are free. You know they get reappointed to some place where they can make money. They're not going to be kept idle, just going like, please come back, guys, please. Mm-hmm. Right? This is a collective action problem, but I don't sleep well thinking about my personal failure to succeed in solving it. That's a horrible sentiment to end on Thanksgiving for. Oh my God, that can't be the last thing I say.
No, we're going to end a little bit more upbeat. Dr. Joyner points out that the university does have a commitment to communities and a robust community health program. And I do believe that U of M can excel in that area. This is my words. I believe that U of M can excel in that area as we do in every other. So we can continue to improve there. I'm going to just go over a little bit to give you the last question. It's that Ellen says, going to the first example of perks of being a U of M employee, is there any policy in place or in the works to address the special treatment and the entitlement to such treatment?
I mean, discretion is kind of a core professional component, right? It's really hard to know how you let a system work that doesn't remove the capacity of professionals to exercise their judgment about their priorities. That's explicitly a thing we are charged to do. And the thought of entirely bureaucratizing that in some checkbox way seems like no fun and like probably really bad for patients, right? The reason we have physicians at this hospital is so we can adapt policies. And so, no, I don't know of any approach that does this. And I'm not sure there's an easy, good solution except to be very cognizant. I will say the other thing we can do is ask, how do we make it easier for other people to have that access to, right? So when we have a new program, is Grosse Pointe the first hospital we go to let them know about that program and make sure that they have our phone numbers and just call if they ever have somebody who's eligible? Or do we go south of 8 Mile instead, right? We have choices as to how we roll out programs. We have choices as to what kind of friendships we build, what kind of networks we build, who we give our phone numbers to say, look, dude, we all know the transfer office, it's bureaucratic as hell. You ever have a problem, you just give me a call. Do we choose to do that at the golf club? Or do we choose to do that in a more intentional way that lives our values?
Thank you so much. And you've ended on a perfect question. I think often to get to the right destination, we have to start off with the right question. And I think you've done that for us today. Thank you so much, Dr. Iwashina, and to Katie and Joe. Thank you to everybody who attended. And we look forward to seeing you all in January for our next presentation. I believe we're taking December off and we'll be back in January for our next forum. Thank you to everyone.
Thank you, guys. This is amazing.